I'll get us started at about in a minute, about 5 minutes past the hour, based on where you're at. And of course, people can join as they come in. I am aware that the chat may be disabled for the participants, so maybe don't do introductions, but we do have a Q&A box that I'll introduce soon as well. All right, thank you, Fanny, for fixing the chat. So yeah, people in the chat who are joining, please feel free to introduce yourself, your name and organization in the chat. And since we're 5 past the hour, I will kick us off. So again, to those who just joined, a very good morning, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Natasha Ledley. I'm a program director at Results for Development. And on behalf of the Africa LEEPS Partnership, we're really thrilled to have you here for today's session on refining our approaches to evidence-informed policymaking, design, and measurement. Today, we hope that we can explore a bit more with you all why measuring how evidence is used in policymaking matters, how we can do it better, and some of the practical challenges that still exist. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping items. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Your name and organization would be great. Feel free to post any questions that you have throughout the session in the Q&A box. We'll be compiling questions from there and bring them up again during the discussion session. We'll also have some members of our team who could respond to some of the questions as we're going through. We do have live interpretation available for today's webinar. If you'd prefer to listen in French, you can access the French interpretation by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then selecting French. Sometimes it's hidden under the 3 dots, the more, at least it is for me. And we'll have interpretation provided in real time throughout the session. Lastly, we do hope to record this webinar to make it available to those who are unable to attend. So hopefully that's not a problem for people who are joining. And my colleague Fanny, who has been really helpful in getting it set up and the technical side, will also be sharing some helpful links related to both the Africa LEEPS partnership in the chat, but also some of the work that our other panelists are doing related to evidence-informed policymaking and measurement. So before we kick off and I hand over to our opening remarks, I did want to give a brief note on the Africa LEEPS partnership. The Africa Learning Together to Advance Evidence and Equity in Policymaking to Achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or in short, the LEEPS partnership, aims to strengthen knowledge translation, which is the synthesis, dissemination, and exchange of evidence, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, with a focus on promoting gender equity at all stages of the policymaking process. The partnership brings together leading evidence organizations from across Africa to learn from each other, exchange knowledge and experiences, and jointly problem solve as they strengthen evidence-informed policymaking to accelerate progress towards the SDGs. The 4 partners that are part of the LEEPS partnership are the Center for Excellence Evidence Policy Action, led by the African Center for Equitable Development, or ASED, the East African Regional Evidence Synthesis Initiative, led by the Center for Rapid Evidence Synthesis, or ACERS, the Alliance for Evidence and Equity in Policymaking in Africa, led by the African Institute for Policy Development, or AFIDEP. And lastly, Results for Development, RFD, serves as the learning and engagement coordinator for LEEPS. If we can move to the next slide, please, Fanny. To help set our stage and to help us really start this conversation, we're honored to welcome Dr. Montasser Kamal, the Director of Global Health at the International Development Research Center in Canada, or IDRC, and a long-standing advocate for evidence-informed policymaking. IDRC itself has played a pivotal role as a champion and investor in strengthening systems for evidence use, including through the LEEPS partnership. So in his remarks, Ramantasar will help us reflect on A, why evidence matters for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, why measuring evidence use matters, and also what makes measurement of evidence use so challenging in practice. And with that, I hand over to you, Ramantasar, to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for the kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here today and to be with you all in this beautiful day, hopefully where you are. It's my absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome you to the webinar on behalf of Canada's International Development Research Center. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. And just a small note for the interpreters, part of my remarks are going to be in French. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that IDRC's head office, in which I'm speaking from today, is situated on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, whose stewardship of the land and waters we now call Ottawa dates back to time immemorial. Tout d'abord, je viens à féliciter le partenariat LEEPS pour l'organisation de ce webinaire, qui nous offre une opportunité de discuter des efforts visant à promouvoir une culture où les données probantes deviennent composantes clés dans le processus de prise de décision équitable et inclusive en Afrique. As part of Canada's foreign affairs and development activities, IDRC is a Canadian Crown corporation mandated to support research and innovation by local experts in developing countries to address development challenges. Since its creation in 1970, IDRC has launched, encouraged, supported, and conducted research on implementing scientific, technical, and other knowledge to advance developing regions' economic and social progress worldwide. After supporting research and innovation in the Global South for more than 55 years, it has become clear that we need to go the extra mile to find a way to position research findings to effectively support progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Notre engagement à atteindre ces objectifs est manifeste dans la stratégie 2020-2030 de CRDI, qui accorde les priorités à l'application des connaissances et à la mise en valeur des résultats de la recherche afin de favoriser leur utilisation et adaptation par les décideurs politiques. The LEEPS partnership is a perfect example that reminds us that we can achieve so much if we work together, mobilizing alliances for greater impact. Funded by IDRC, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the Robert Bosch Foundation, LEEPS brings together Africa-based experts from leading organizations such as the African Center for Equitable Development, the African Institute for Development Policy, and the Center for Rapid Evidence Synthesis that are conducting the work on the ground. It also includes the US-based experts from Results for Development for the coordination of the partnership. Through effective engagement with local and regional policymakers, LEEPS partners respond to policymakers' requests for evidence to guide their decisions. They're also receiving increasing requests from various sectors such as transportation and education, in addition to their two priority topics now, which are reproductive health and transition to low-carbon economies. It is clear that much could be done to build a culture where evidence will become the backbone of people-centered decisions. Je souhaite profiter de cette occasion pour inviter les organisations qui partagent ce même idée à nous rejoindre pour supporter l'initiative LEEPS afin de renforcer la capacité des institutions africaines à élaborer des politiques qui répondent aux besoins des populations. I look forward to an insightful discussion on how refining our approaches to evidence-informed policymaking, design, and measurement can help shape a brighter future for Africa. Thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you for your time and interest. Merci à toutes et tous. Back to you, Natasha. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Montasser, for that really insightful framing. We want to hear also from you all in the audience, so feel free to please keep adding questions or comments in the Q&A box or in the chat. We've wanted to actually include a quick poll to understand what all of you all who work in evidence-informed policymaking in different contexts, on different sectors and countries, what you all see as the biggest challenge you face in measuring the use of evidence in policymaking. Hopefully you'll be able to see a Zoom poll that will pop up in front of you, and we'll be able to, if you have sort of anything to elaborate on that, feel free to elaborate in the chat. And I'll pause right now briefly to let your responses come in and then share the results. Fanny, do you see results coming in?
Yes, I do. Let me find a way to share that with you.
And while you're pulling that up, we did share this on LinkedIn as well. And what we saw there was we don't have that many votes, but we have about 3 and 4 people saying that their biggest challenge was in having no clear indicators or tools. And then 1 in 4 saying that it was hard to actually show that pathway for evidence impact and to make that connection. But Fanny, if you can, I don't think I see the results. Maybe I don't know where to look.
Once we're done, I can end the poll and share.
Okay. We'll give it another minute and then we'll end the poll at 17 past. I also do see a hand raised in the chat, and if you would like to add your comment in the chat, that would be easier, or in the Q&A box, that would be great. And Fanny, feel free to end the poll so we can share the results. Oh, perfect. I see it too. All right, so we have a slightly different kind of piece here based on, and there are more people here. So we also see kind of a spread where here sort of with our panel, with our participants, that there's sort of a harder link to policy change. And I'd like our panelists to be able to reflect on this and use this to kind of frame some of their discussions. There still is a need for indicators and tools, but it's really that connection that seems to be more of an issue for more of the for more of the people working in this space. Then, of course, that we have equal amount of votes for limited access to policymakers, changing priorities, both political and otherwise. And I see in other, and hopefully we can get some more detail on the people who responded other in the chat and hear more. So with that, thank you everyone for joining that particular poll. I would like to turn over to our panelists. Our panel discussion will be called From Insight to Impact, so navigating the challenges of measuring evidence use. And we're joined today by an excellent group of thought leaders from across Africa and the global evidence ecosystem. In alphabetical order of their first names, so no thing. We have Andile Madanzala, who is the Director of Innovation and Equity from the Pan-African Collective for Evidence, or PACE, where she works at the intersection of research, innovation, and technology, making evidence accessible, relatable, and impactful for decision makers. We have Dr. Christine Kelly, an lead evaluation specialist at the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE, currently leading several projects through the FCDO Research Commissioning Center with a particular focus on evidence use in policymaking. We have Dr. Frejus Toto, who's the Executive Director of the African Center for Equitable Development, or ACED, and he leads ACED's work on supporting African policymakers and practitioners in designing and implementing policies for better jobs, gender equality, and well-being by making development knowledge more relevant, more accessible, and applied. I believe that one of our panelists was unable to join, so I'll do a little bit of tweaking my questions, but if at some point Dr. Violet Marunga is a senior research and policy analyst at the African Institute for Development Policy, AFDEP, where she leads work on promoting, supporting, strengthening capacity for evidence-informed decision-making. And I do hope that Violet is able to join, but I, in the meantime, will actually start my questions with Christine, if that's okay with you, Christine. So we've saw through the poll, Christine, that evidence-informed policymaking and measuring its impact can be extremely difficult to quantify, both because of, through the poll, we saw the lack of indicators or tools that exist, but also how, kind of making that connection between the work that's being done and then actually being able to measure that impact. So what are some of the more promising approaches or frameworks that we currently do have for measuring how evidence is used? And what dimensions are still difficult to capture and what can be improved? And I know that your work through at 3IE, just through this Research Commissioning Center, especially focuses a lot on trying to build this this piece of evidence around measuring evidence. So over to you, Christine.
Perfect. Thank you, Natasha, and thank you very much for the invitation to the webinar today. I'm really looking forward to learning from it as well and hearing about others' perspectives. But yes, happy to kick us off with our experience at the FCDO Research Commissioning Center, which is a new funding body that commissions and manages research on behalf of the FCDO. And yes, as Natasha mentioned, one of the big flagship programs is a new program of work on understanding evidence use in policymaking in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia.
Christine, just sorry to interrupt. Your voice is a little muffled. It was clear, I know, when we checked earlier. So I don't know. You can try again.
If I'll get a bit closer. Does that help?
Yes, a lot. Thank you so much. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yes, so when we were setting out to design and commission this new research program on evidence-informed policymaking, we were reflecting on the questions exactly as in the poll, sort of what would success look like? How would we know if evidence was informing policy and in what ways? How could we make that link to policy change and what measures could be available to, to indicate that link? So we went through an exercise of creating a conceptual framework of evidence-informed policymaking mapped against an inventory of available measures that could be used to capture those domains. And so based on the existing literature and the expertise of the team that developed the framework, we firstly conceptualize EIP outcomes in 4 domains to reflect the complexity of policymaking processes and the multiple influences that evidence can have on it. So we broke it down in terms of attitudes and behaviors around evidence use. So does evidence change the value that policymakers place on evidence or their propensity to refer to it? Conceptual outcomes, which refer to how policymakers think about policy issues and the intellectual frameworks they use. Procedural outcomes around when evidence changes the process of how policy decisions are made and debates are had. And then content outcomes when evidence directly leads to a piece of legislation, a spending decision, a policy position, or other sort of observable policy content outcome. And so some of these domains are much more readily measurable than others, and they certainly operate on different time horizons. And so I think it's important, firstly, to be guided by what impact would be the most meaningful to capture in the particular circumstances and sort of what the objective of the measurement is. But in terms of what we found about available measures, we identified 124 measures from 238 studies that have been used in some way to measure evidence use in policymaking, or the factors that facilitate or hinder evidence-informed policymaking. So there is a lot out there. I mean, we found a very kind of fragmented and siloed literature that this is a first attempt to bring together. But I think the first observation is that there has been a lot of work in this space, and including some really robustly developed and validated tools that could be good starting points to think about measuring EIP. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just to give a bit of an overview of what the measures cover, most of the measures and indicators were generated through surveys and interviews, with a smaller number coming from other methods such as observation or document analysis. We're starting to see come through some new kind of technological approaches, for example, using large language models to code the language in policy documents, speeches, and media reports as a way of kind of curating and understanding large volumes of information. So I think real exciting prospects for methodological innovation here. In terms of other coverage, geographically, the most common areas of use were in North America, across the United States and Canada, but some other clusters in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in Kenya and Nigeria. And sector-wise, perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of measures originate in the health sector. And so I think taken collectively, there is an important opportunity to consider the role of context in these measures, both geographically and by sector, and to really consider and explore the applicability of measures to other areas. And then finally, if we could go to the next slide, please. When we mapped the measures against the components of the conceptual framework, we found a large imbalance in the prevalence of measures of attitudes and behaviors around evidence use relative to other types of EIP outcome. You can see there were 91 measures of attitudes or behaviors with respect to evidence use, and comparatively few conceptual content or procedural outcome measures. And so again, I see a huge opportunity here to develop more innovative measures that move beyond just self-reports of policymakers' sort of attitudes and intentions around evidence use, but start to get at more observable behaviors of policy outcomes, but also to account for the variety of influences that evidence can have on policymaking, and sort of widen the dimensions that we measure to really have a diverse and robust toolkit to capture these different dimensions based on what's appropriate and plausible for the context. And just finally, I wanted to emphasize that these measures focus on tracking the use of evidence in policymaking, but they don't look at whether the policy had the intended impact on sort of life outcomes that it was intended to. So that it's based on this premise that evidence-informed policymaking leads to these positive impacts, but I think there's a huge gap in approaches to actually measuring those downstream impacts, which I think is something that we might come on to later in the discussion. But I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I know that we've posted some of the links to these materials in the chat, and I've had, it's really been interesting to kind of read through and go through and see the work that, that it's hoping to build out of the work that's already been done at 3IE. With that, I'd like, Violet, I see that you've joined. Thank you so much for joining. I would really like, given that based on what Christine said, which comes more from this kind of looking at the evidence, looking at what has been done around these pieces, but your team is doing a lot of implementing of evidence-informed policymaking programs, and also trying to measure that how it's being used. So I'd love for you to provide any kind of comment based on Christine shared, but really thinking about it from the perspective of your work in implementing these programs, and to share what persistent challenges really do exist in measuring how evidence is used by policymakers, and if there are particular entry points in the policy cycle where measurement feels more feasible. So it would be great, Violet, if you can share more with us on that.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Christine, for your presentation, and to everyone else who's joining. Hello, and I'm sorry that I joined a bit late. But yeah, to your question, Natasha, yes, we've been implementing programs or initiatives that aim to strengthen evidence-informed decision-making at AFIDEP. So through all of the years we've been doing this work, of course, we've also been trying to see how best to measure the outcome of our initiatives. I would say that we've done very well in being able to measure immediate results of some of our work, be it the trainings that we may implement with policymakers and researchers and other stakeholders to improve their understanding and confidence in, finding high quality evidence and using it in their decision-making processes. Be it in dialogues and trying to capture views of participants of the dialogues as to what the value was of the dialogue and what they took away from those. What we've struggled more with, and I think Christine touched on that a little bit in her in summary in her presentation, is documenting and learning how our interventions and activities actually influence, change, or improve the day-to-day work of the people that we work with, right? Be it capacity development. So how is the capacity development that we do translating into better practices within the policymaking space? And then as it relates to, maybe research that we may share in dialogues, in meetings, how are these being used? I mean, we really don't have a good way of really knowing the extent of our impact at that level. Although, of course, we've had some successes. I would say that when we see successes, usually it's happening in real time during implementation of the project, because of course we have that interaction going on with the participants that we're working with. So we may be able to see those impacts that we see in real time, but not necessarily that we're doing some formal assessment. It's just that we're learning as we go, as we implement, how maybe a policy decision was influenced by an analysis that we did, and there's some examples that I can speak to on that. I will come to that a bit later. A major contributing factor of all this is really the lack of resources to do the kind of follow-up that would be required to document the impact of our work. This is an area maybe we can look into seeing how technology could be helpful, even though I don't have a clear perspective in my mind as to how that would work. But just speaking to some of the impacts that we've had, and we've had impacts across the policy cycle, agenda setting, policy formulation, implementation. But as I noted, most of these impacts, we see them because we are still implementing our project and we are able to get this information through our interaction. For instance, some of our work on the demographic dividend is a very good example where that work, that analysis directly led to the African Union declaring 2017 and even the years, the decade after that, the year and the decade of demographic dividend and investing in youth. And this work also led to several countries that we were working with on this, helping them to come up with their roadmaps for demographic dividend. That work directly fed into national policies and population policies. So, but all this, we were seeing this as we implemented the project, not necessarily because we were like, doing like a formal assessment, as you will. So what that means is that it's really helpful to have projects or initiatives that are kind of long-term, to be able to allow for these impacts to happen and for that information to come through within our interactions. But also, I would say that on that as well, so I'm talking about, big changes is what we learn about, but small changes about like changes in practice on a day-to-day basis, that really needs formal assessments to be undertaken. And this is where the need for resources allocated to those formal assessments, longer-term projects, as well, to be able to allow for those impacts to actually be generated is important. The other thing I want to say on that, in terms of opportunities to improve how we track and understand evidence use, as I've noted, longer term investments, but also as practitioners in evidence-informed decision-making, we have to deliberately build in activities for ongoing evaluation of our work. We have to make that a cultural practice within our initiatives. But also we need capacity development, because I think a lot of us we're not experts in impact evaluation. I think impact evaluation is really a niche area. It has its own theoretical frameworks and all that. So I think practitioners in the EIP field could benefit from capacity development, and groups like 3IE can be helpful in providing those tools and methodology and approaches that we could apply. And then of course, sharing platforms like we are having today to discuss and exchange on ideas and practices is useful as well. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Violet. It's really helpful. And I know some of these challenges are what we hear from different partners around the length of projects, capacities, available evidence, and also resources to actually be able to measure some of those that impact. Andile, I know I have another question for you later, but I would love if you I know that at PACE, y'all also are implementing a lot of EIP programs, but thinking a lot about the use of evidence. If you have any brief remarks or comments or questions for Violet based on her remarks.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Violet, as well, for sharing your experiences. Just to echo or to add to some of the points that you've made. So in our experience, we found that one of the big challenges with measuring how evidence is used by policymakers is that policymaking is influenced by various factors. And I think all of us might know this, right? It's never just evidence. It's evidence, it's policy priorities, it's relationships, it's culture, it's the values, it's the experience of the policymaker themselves. So it therefore becomes very difficult to pinpoint the direct use of evidence. But I think probably where measurement seems feasible is when policy is being formulated or revised, because this would really give us an opportunity to set up some mechanisms where we can then reflect, or the policymaker can reflect on evidence use and how then we can measure the use of that evidence as well. So, and also just to add a point on the tracking and understanding evidence use, I think it's very important that we move towards understanding that evidence uptake is very relationship and trust-based. I think also we all know this as well. So I think this therefore means that we need to move away from just tracking citations and outputs, but also looking into tracing or tracking engagement and influence as well, because that then speaks to really the relationship and trust that centers around evidence uptake. That's what some of the few points that I wanted to add to some of the points that you shared, Violet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Violet,
Also,
do you want to respond
just
to that?
reminded me-
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so I just wanted to build on Andile's points, and one thing I forgot to mention there is that you know, these government platforms that allow for these interactions to go on even as initiatives end, and you have this platform that you continuously engage in, are very critical, like government technical working groups. So you get to also learn through your, you know, ongoing interactions informally beyond the project's lifespan of your impact. But one thing I want to mention that I've noted about those working groups is that they've started to meet less and less, at least in Kenya, within the spaces that I work, which is a concern, and it's related to the aspect of funding shrinking, and these working groups being very dependent on development partner assistance. So that's one thing I wanted to, I forgot to mention earlier, and Andila's remarks kind of prompted me to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you, Violet. No, I'm happy you were able to add that in. So sort of I'll move over to Fridges if you're able. You know, from your experience working with decision makers, policy makers, what does meaningful evidence use look like in practice? And this is, I'm building off what Andile said and Violet and also Christine around, you know, where there's measures around attitudes and behaviors, but maybe less on the conceptual concept. There's it's not just about citations, it might be about actually the actual engagements. So, you know, based on the context in which you work, what are some of the innovative context-specific ways to document how evidence is being used? And what do you think is still missing from some of the existing measures and tools that are out there? Over to you, Fridges.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to to be in this panel and share a bit of our experience. And it's always difficult to be the last to speak after Violet, Christine, and Andile. So I will react mainly on some of the points that they have already mentioned and share a bit of our experience at the African Center for Equitable Development. One thing that is quite important that I want to share is we maybe need to start with what we call evidence. I think it matters a lot. For example, evidence on what? Evidence from who and for what purpose? You know, sometimes when you want to have some impact with policymakers, the first question they ask is, I mean, who are you to provide evidence to us? So the source of the evidence is already a very important starting point, even before you talk about anything related to impact. And sometimes you may not be aware, but the most relevant knowledge isn't actually coming from the researchers. A policymaker, by default, most of them, they are coming from political parties. They have their political base. So sometimes they are more reactive or sensitive to evidence or knowledge that is coming from their local communities and not from big professors at universities. So at some point, it's also good to understand those dynamics and see how we can position what we call evidence into the overall ecosystem. The other point is, I think Andile Violet has mentioned that, is the issue of attribution. We often try to draw a straight line from evidence to policy change, but the reality is very far more complex. Evidence is just one input, and in some context, it's not even the most important input. The main input may be coming from political incentives, from budget constraints, or sometimes even from interpersonal personal relationships. And as think tanks or as knowledge brokers, we should find a way of having a good understanding of all that. And related to how policy is made, I think Violet has mentioned that very well. Policy change takes time. It involves negotiation, iteration, timing, and most importantly, trust. But when you look at the current system that we have, which is providing knowledge or which is promoting evidence-informed policymaking, we are still largely project-based. So you are involved in a process for 3 years where the objective is to support or to influence a particular policy. You spend the first year to build trust. By the time that you get closer to the minister, he will be changed, someone else will come. You start the whole process, and then you are done. The 3 years are gone. You have not done that much, but it's actually the process. It has to be long, it has to be messy, and you need to be there. So the current system also should be a bit aligned with what really real policymaking is, to allow knowledge brokers, researchers to be able to build very long-term relationship with the policymakers, making sure that they stay engaged long enough to see the change that may happen even after the project. And learning from all this and how difficult it is to track and measure the policy change. At ASED, we do mainly 2 things. First, we do a lot of what we call process tracing. So when we engage in a particular policy issue, we make all effort to document the process, not just the outcomes, but mainly the journey that we are taking. Who do we involve? How these people have been changing? What is the turnover in the ministry? What was the or what is the power dynamic that are in place? What decisions were made along the way? What were the incentives and constraints that shaped the process? So we make sure that we document very well the very tiny changes, the very tiny movement that we made along the whole process. And it helps us really understand the real life mechanism of evidence use, well beyond what we would put in a log frame or in a project activity plan. So that's one thing that we really do in terms of process tracing. The second thing that we do, which is also part of our ongoing reflection, is maybe to go beyond what we call policy change as the only measure of knowledge translation or measure of success of knowledge translation. I usually say that even preserving the status quo is a win. In some situations, you are not aiming for changing a particular policy, but you are just trying to make sure that policymakers understand that we maybe need to stay there and do not get into harmful policies. Because you can also do policy change, but what you are doing is not the right thing to do. And preserving the status quo is already a kind of success that needs to be acknowledged. And we even need to go beyond that. We can have impact that may be around cultural aspects. For example, helping communities through research to reflect on the assumptions, to engage into dialogues, or even to reframe a problem is a kind of impact. If we do a good research that brings a particular dimension of a problem to the table, it's already a kind of impact. We are not yet into policy impact, but bringing the attention to a particular problem in the society is already something that can be achieved through research. The last point that I want to mention, which is also a big lesson for us, being in this field for 15 years now, sometimes you are not the good, you are not the good person to Hey, what happened?
We're not sure. I'm sorry for the technical. Hopefully people, I see some,
I hope people will come back.
yeah, I see some attendees. Pages, you're too interesting. My technology broke.
Yeah.
I see people coming back. I'm really sorry. Apologies to everyone coming in. I'm not sure what happened, but Fanny, if you can share your screen again, we'll jump back in as if there was no break. And apologies to everyone for that glitch. You would think that we had figured it out during COVID and all our online pieces.
You need to set up the interpreter. Reset.
Apologies again for this dropping. I hope all our panelists are still there. Yeah, I see everybody. So Fridges, I'll hand back to you to close to complete your remarks. It was no fault of your own that that the Zoom meeting ended. So back to you. And then once you're done, Christine, I'll hand over to you to give to just sort of what do you call have brief follow-up on Freitas's comments. So over to you, Freitas. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Yes, I was actually closing my remarks. I was mainly saying that sometimes the researcher or even the knowledge broker is not the right person to engage with the policymakers. And we should invest also to understand the political economy to see who are those who have the power to make the shift in terms of policy, and then we make sure that we communicate our research to those ones. We have in our countries in where we operate, we already have some situations where it makes sense for us not to directly engage with a particular minister, but to get through civil society organizations, even funders or private sector, to make sure that they are aware of the kind of evidence that we want to put there, the kind of policy change that we want to promote. So engaging, it's not always that we should engage with the actual policymakers, but we should do a very good assessment of the ecosystem and identify other stakeholders that could be that could have more power or more agency to engage with the policymakers. So that's what I wanted to share. I think impact, we will be talking about this for many years again, because the matter is not simple. Attribution will always be a big problem. We will not be able to clearly say that research or evidence has led to policy change, and we really need to continue supporting the system that would match how things really happen. And things are slow, things are relational in nature, and policy making is, I would not say it's a mess, but it's not linear, and we need to be aware of that and align our tools on that specific on that specificity of the subject we are working on. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Freitas. And I think that's so helpful. I had myself not thought about the do no harm, that, it's not just about, how it's not about measuring necessarily policy change, because some policies may not be as necessarily doing better than the status quo. So with that, Christine, I know you all have done so much work around thinking about this at the more global level, and I'd love to get some brief response to Frejus from you on how what he said, which is based on the kind of African political realities as well, which is true for many parts of the world. But how your any reflections from what he shared. So over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Natasha, and thank you, Frejus. Yes, I think those remarks really resonate with the thinking that we're doing within the FCDO-RCC. This idea that it's so crucial to understand the policymaking context and the actors involved and the processes, and certainly not thinking about it as a linear kind of process that evidence translates into policy, but recognizing all the multitude of other factors and incentives and constraints that play a part in the system. And of course, that has huge influence on measurement as well. So if we think about the measures that are sitting in the RCC measures inventory, thinking about, are we asking the right people? So who are the ones that are engaged in the policymaking process, and are we sure that we're capturing them in our monitoring tools? Are we asking the right questions? I think some of these may come from sort of preconceived ideas about what policymaking processes look like, and really need to be grounded in the context and understanding what the system is, and therefore what the right questions are to recognize how influence is, how evidence is being used and influencing policy processes, and also targeting the right outcome. I mean, again, echoing Frejus's point about policy change is not always what you're aiming for. Sometimes it is something more behind the scenes, building relationships, changing research cultures, influencing agendas. And so it's not always those kind of policy content outcomes that are the right ones to be measuring. And so thinking about what are the ultimate objectives here, and what are the best ways to demonstrate that. And I think, yeah, the huge challenge is that a lot of this is quite informal and relationship driven, which we've tried to capture through the RCC conceptual framework. So you may have seen that the pathways of change from evidence to policymaking include things like relationships and networks, processes, capacities. And so really recognizing all the different ingredients that go into evidence-informed policymaking. And also the research that we're commissioning through the RCC has a huge focus on understanding how policymaking processes work in practice. So that first step of really understanding how it works, so that we can start to understand the levers and strategies that could be leveraged to make use of evidence. So we're really excited to see what comes out of that. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. I do have a question specifically related to that, but I'll wait for that for the Q&A session. Frejus, anything you want to respond to Christine on? Otherwise, I'll move over to my question for Andile. Okay.
No. It's all good on my side. Yeah. Good. Thank you, Christine. Perfect. I think, yeah, a lot of informal things happen in the process, and it's just important for us to acknowledge that, and to be prepared to ask the right questions, to engage with the right people. Yeah, totally agree.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. So Andile, as we've been, you're working in the context, and as Violet said, with this kind of shrinking development funding assistance for this kind of work, and also to kind of get the time of policymakers, we know that there's sort of an increasing pressure to actually demonstrate results in EIP. And I think this comes out even more in terms of kind of the work that the FCDO RCC is doing. So it would be, you mentioned that it's important to measure the impact of evidence use beyond just, citations. Why is it important to measure the impact of it beyond just simply tracking whether evidence was consulted? And are there tools or approaches that you all use at PACE that help assess whether evidence-informed decisions actually contributed to better outcomes? So making that link between not just it being being used in new policies or policy updates, but seeing the outcome or the next step, the more sort of longer term piece. So over to you, Andile, to share a bit more on that.
Thank you so much again, Natasha. If I speak a bit somehow, it's because I'm trying to speak slower than I usually do, just to ensure that translation is sort of keeping up with me. But I think the question about why it is important to measure the impact of evidence use requires us to go back to the reason why we advocate for the use of evidence. And I think as advocates of evidence-informed decision-making, we always say that evidence use is important in ensuring that decision-making and implementation is more effective. And that is because, of course, evidence tells us what works for who, why, at what cost, right? So then we are able to implement policies and that are more effective, right? So it becomes therefore important to not just measure whether evidence was used, but to measure whether this use of evidence has actually translated to policies and implementation that results in improved development results, such as reducing poverty or inequality, which is one of the sort of the aims of the Pan-African Collective for Evidence. So while there is a growing recognition and investment towards initiatives that are aimed at supporting the use of evidence in decision-making, I think initiatives such as, for example, building capacities of policymakers to use evidence, or initiatives that are aimed at institutionalizing the use of evidence, these initiatives really should not only measure whether evidence is used, but measure whether the use of evidence has translated to improved development results. And then I'd like to really speak to our work. Fanny, if you can share that slide for me. So in our work, we really aimed to scope what measures are used to assess the impact of initiatives to support evidence-informed decision-making. And in doing this, we followed evidence mapping processes to collect an evidence base that develops, proposes indicators or measures that can be used to measure evidence use. And we searched a number of organizational websites, government websites, and also academic databases using an exhaustive search string with Boolean operators. And we landed at 37 EIDM measures that can be used to measure evidence use. And that is what you're looking at your screen right now. But what is nice is that we were able to map these measures onto Prezi, which means it's quite interactive. So the link that is shared on the chat, you will see that when you click on each and every one of these measures, you are able to see individual indicators, which we found over 400 indicators. And really, we then looked at these indicators closely, and we realized that they can be categorized into 4 main categories, which speaks to some of the points that Fred just made, is that we can measure the process of evidence use, the context of evidence use, the outcomes of evidence use, and then the impact of evidence use, of course. And I think overall, we found more than we had anticipated. As you also saw the database that was shared by Kelly, there's quite a lot happening in the field. We have a long and history of trying to measure evidence use, which shows that we have been thinking about measuring evidence use quite a bit. But we found specifically 2 big gaps. The first one is just around measures that are developed in the Global South, measures that can be used in the Global South. So, but someone can argue that measures developed in the Global North can be used. They don't have to be context specific. But then another big gap was that there weren't a lot of measures that were focused on how we assess the impact of using evidence in terms of improving development outcomes. We are currently in the process of developing this work and aligning it a bit more with the conceptual framework that was shared by Kelly. But I think what Fred just said really helps to sum up what I just said now, which is we are going to talk about impact for a while. I don't think we particularly have figured it out, but I think it's an ongoing conversation as to how we attribute the use of evidence to development outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andile, for that. I think this is something that we've all I think there's a lot that's coming out from here that that is resonating across all these teams, and I'm sure with others as well. Fridges, if you have any brief response to what Ndile shared, or any further question for Ndile based on the work that they're doing, over to you. If not, I'm happy to kind of move us forward. So let me know.
Just one comment on what Ndile. I think, yes, that's a very important point of the whole debate around showing the impact of evidence informed policy making. And there's one thing that we need to acknowledge. Most of this motivation also is coming from funders. Over the past few years, we've seen a lot of pressure coming from funders who really want to see more proof of I would say, evidence on the kind of work that we do. So many of our organizations have been put under pressure to, I would not say to justify, but to show some impact. And it's a good news, but it's also a bad news, because it's a good news because it's bringing us to the field of making sure that we can trace something, making sure that we can put out there the resources that we need to have a meaningful work. But it's also a bad news because it can also have a negative effect by putting organization to try to show impact where there is no impact, or where there is not yet a possibility of showing impact. And this is an issue for the whole ecosystem. Will a funder be comfortable of having a grantee which will come at the end of a 3-year project and clearly explain why they could not have any policy change? I think this is a question for all of us in the ecosystem, and motivation is very important, and we need to not push too much. I've seen organizations trying to link their very nice report on educational policy change, and I was asking myself, I'm not very sure we can do that. But if funders are, putting the pressure, organization will always try to show impact where maybe the process is still ongoing and we cannot yet talk about impact. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Frejus. I think that's super helpful, and that is one of the questions that came up. I know in the chat, so that's something that I wanted to pose later to Christine. Something a little bit related to that, but before we do that, I do want to give everyone, all our panelists or whoever remains, please do add your questions in either the chat or the Q&A. If there are comments, anything for the panelists, for others, we'd be happy to have this be a more interactive discussion. In the meanwhile, I do want to thank all our panelists for those rich insights. And as we bring in kind of voices from our broader audience, I will get us kicked off with a question for Violet, which I might ask some of the others too, but specifically asking Violet, given the EIP work that they're doing at AFIDEP. Do you have sort of an example? Have you seen findings or these this measurement piece around measurement of evidence use? Have you actually seen that influence policy or investment decisions? So have you all been able to use that to say, look, this worked here like this, and this was used, and this was the outcome? So, either for funding decisions or for further policy or engaging with other policymakers. If you have an example of it, it would be great if you can share that with us. If not, what we should be thinking is not just about measuring, it's about also putting them in a format or in a way that's actually useful for either inviting more investments or for bringing in more engagement from policymakers to say, if you do use it, you can do all these other things. So would love to hear, Violet, your experience at AFIDEP and otherwise on actually using the indicators and impact numbers on evidence use.
Yeah, we have been involved in initiatives in the past that did evaluate the work that we were doing, like the BCure. If you all know the BCure project or program, at the time, DFID did commission an impact evaluation. And I think that then informed their strategy going forward. So that's one specific one I can speak to. Whether it had any impact in the countries where we were working on this project, I wouldn't be able to say that. I don't think so. But what I can say is that out of that work, we were able to get the government entities that we were working with to allocate more resources to evidence-informed decision-making, because we were working with departments of research within ministries of health in Kenya and Malawi, and parliaments in Kenya and Malawi as well. So, but that was more of the work we were doing around advocacy to leaders about the importance of investing in evidence systems within their institutions, evidence-informed decision-making structures and processes. So not so much the results of an evaluation of our work that informed that, but more because at that point, the work was still quite nascent, and we didn't have previous evaluations anyway of our work. So yeah, I know I haven't really responded to your question. Yeah, but at the funder level, I think at the funder level, definitely evaluations of our work has informed funding decisions. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Violet. And I'll actually hand over to you, Christine, to respond. And we have a question from one of our participants around measuring stakeholder engagement, especially in EIDM. And we've been talking about that, how these informal pieces are kind of important. I know there is something on it in the conceptual framework and in the measures inventory. But the piece that I want to kind of stress on is they said that these relational aspects of EIP are often underfunded and don't align with the timelines that sort of are being funded. And I know 3IE is not a funder, but as you all are commissioning kind of research to kind of do more in this space, I wanted to kind of understand from you how, from the funder perspective, or that research perspective, how with this new FCDO work that y'all are doing, how y'all are thinking about these timelines for seeing policy change. And I'm even thinking about the most recent kind of EO expressions of interest and thing that were put out that have sort of these 2-year or something timeframes, which is a short window to see actual policy change. So over to you, Christine.
Absolutely. And I think this is a completely fair challenge and something that we're grappling with in a very live way at the RCC, as you say, in the context of this new program of work. I think the tension on the one hand of, operating within funding and policy constraints, and on the other, what is a realistic timescale for seeing some of these long-term policy outcomes. And so I think definitely starting from the position of being realistic about what is achievable within that time. And so an approach that we're taking within the RCC is to start a project with developing a sort of stakeholder engagement and impact plan and mapping out, this is what we expect to do, this is what we expect to achieve within the program, but being very mindful about what's realistic and not placing expectations for large scale change that we wouldn't expect to be feasible. And so I think definitely being very mindful of that tension, but then identifying potential levers for more long-term opportunities to follow up beyond the immediate kind of program timescale. definitely something that we're interested in thinking about. I guess the other piece is around funding and not having the resourcing to conduct some of this work. So again, that's something we're very interested in understanding more about and building into the projects. I think starting from the perspective of getting a firmer handle on the costs of some of, what it takes to build relationships, what it takes to do this robust evidence uptake activity, and therefore have more information to guide future efforts around, being realistic about what's required. But yeah, it's been really insightful to hear your experiences, and something we'll certainly be continuing to think about.
Thank you so much, Christine. So I'll actually take that first part of that question a little bit more for you, Ndile, if you don't mind. And I see some people have their hands up in the chat, so feel free to write your question in the chat or in the Q&A section, or if it's a comment, that's fine as well. It'll be easier. But in the meanwhile, Ndile, if you don't mind actually understanding how at PACE are you all measuring the stakeholder engagement or relational aspect, especially in sort of political environments that keep changing. I know that Frejus was talking about some of the process tracing work that could have some piece, and that Christine is talking about stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement and how that's being planned. But it would be great to hear how PACE is thinking about, is sort of measuring stakeholder engagement.
Thank you for that question again, Natasha. So this is an interesting one because at PACE, really, relationships and that sort of link with stakeholders is really at the core of the work that we do. So what we do is that we follow a co-production approach with the sort of this evidence synthesis products that we produce. So this means that if we are doing a rapid review, a systematic review, or maybe an evidence map, it sort of includes stakeholders in the space from defining the question until we deliver the evidence product. So we engage with them on a day-to-day basis to ensure that it really speaks to their priorities and it is relevant to their work as well. So we have, I like that Violet actually spoke about GJBQ, because it's some of the relationships formed then, which was before my time even. So I think what we've found is that relationships are key to the work that we do, and we have long-standing relationships with some of the stakeholders that we engage with all the time, I think. And then when it comes to really measuring those, I think it speaks to the impact of the work that we have had. So what we do is that we really are intentional about sort of noting the times when we were able to influence policy, or we were able to feature in very big policy discussions in the country. And that is always as a result of our relationships, and that's probably how we measure. I don't know if that works, probably like a proxy type of thing, where how we measure the stakeholder engagements or the relationships that we have is through sort of how it has impacted the work that we do and how they influence also what our priorities are and what we count as relevant as well. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
It does. Thank you so much, Ndile. And I see a question, and I sort of will take this as a kind of, I would say, last question, but if others have questions, please, but I will try to respond even in writing. And maybe I'll have this one for you, Frejus. So there's a question that says, in the case of changing priorities, how do we actually measure impact? So that's fine. We have understanding of how to measure some of these stakeholder engagement, some proxies on how to do it, some comments about thinking about the longer term funding duration, the shorter term funding duration, and being aware of those. But in terms of even where priorities are changing, sort of both institutionally at country level, but also politically, how can evidence use impact be measured? So how is ASAD thinking about this, Frejus? What kind of indicators or measures are you all using to understand it when there's these changing priorities? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And I've seen the question is coming in the Q&A. The whole point for us is that we do not want to say this in just with a perspective of having an indicator. I think the most important for us is to make sure that we can explain the narrative that is behind that change in terms of priorities and how we are contributing to that. Changing priorities can come from many perspectives. It can be changing the priorities from the policymakers' perspective. It can be from funders. Let's say, for example, it's coming from the policymakers. When the priorities change, it all depends on how flexible the organization is, and especially how flexible its resources are, so that it can adapt to those changes, or they can just continue the kind of work that they are doing, and also not make the mistake of following the political changes. Maybe what we are calling here change in priorities is not really in terms of development priorities, but maybe it's in terms of options that the current government or the current leaders are taking. And the organization should be very much aware of the fact that, are they going to pursue this kind of work even if it's not a priority for the country, or the way that they work is more on supporting the government where they think the priorities are. So I think it all depends on where how the organization, the think tank or the knowledge broker is positioned. I know many think tanks that are working and are not following the political agenda or the policy priorities. They are following their own research agenda, and they are following the priorities that they think are the most important. So it all depends on how the organization is positioned. But I will not definitely say that we need to find an indicator to show that there is evidence use or not. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frages. I think that's really helpful. If there's any additional remarks from any of our panelists that you want to share before I close us out, feel free to come off mute. Just based on the discussion, I think it's been really helpful to have this, especially from my perspective of having a few partners on the panel who are working really in delivering these programs and this work, a few partners who are thinking kind of a little bit removed from the how are we measuring what exists and how do we kind of push that piece of work forward, and then some who are actually at the intersection of both of those. So that's been really helpful. So if anyone has any closing comments before, Violet, were you going to say something or no? So you're not muted, but you may not have to.
Sorry. Yes. No, this is a legacy no mute.
Okay, no problem.
Yes.
All right. Well, in that case, I obviously want to thank all our panelists and participants for joining, but wanted to kind of mark just a few quick takeaways that at least I took from this session, and I'm sure there's more and others, and we'd love to keep this conversation going. That measuring evidence use, as we've known, is critical, but it's complex. And at least for me coming into this, which I should have been better aware of, is that it's not just better tools or shared frameworks or indicators that we need, which we do. But we need to collaborate better to do it in a way that's actually coherent and kind of telling the same story. But what's equally important, or maybe in some cases even more important, are the relationships, the context, the informal dynamics, just as much as the frameworks that we build. And as a Mel person, that seems a little scary, but I think that is our job at hand. And just to say that the LEEPS partnership is working to document, to test, and scale some of these approaches that are really rooted in these political realities in the African context. And we hope that you'll stay engaged with us through the rest of this year, and then ongoing work through our partners or further work. And really, again, a huge thank you to our panelists for your time, your thoughtful contributions, and to everybody else for joining the webinar today. Thanks a lot.